Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Love Doesn't Hurt podcast. I'm your host, Ashley Leonard. So I wanted to start this episode off with a bit of an apology. I had a super stressful semester at school and took a lot of time off the podcast to focus on my classes. I'm really hoping to stay consistent with uploads for the foreseeable future, and I'm planning to upload every other Friday, so subscribe to be notified when I post a new episode. I also updated the podcast logo, so I really hope you guys like it. With all that being said, let's get into the content. After taking a pretty long break, I was hoping to finish my series of episodes describing the types of abuse in order for people to be able to identify them and really reference those episodes quickly if necessary, but I felt like this conversation needed to be had while the topic was relevant. The Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard trial wrapped up not too long ago, and people appear to have some mixed feelings and misconceptions about the results of the trial. Just as a disclaimer, the information I'm presenting and discussing is strictly my opinion after watching the majority of the trial with legal commentary and from doing my own research. Here's a little bit of background on what the trial was actually about. The Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard trial began with a defamation lawsuit by Johnny Depp in 2019, claiming that Amber made false statements and acted with actual malice when writing an opinion editorial in 2018 for the Washington Post. The statements that Depp claimed were false and defamatory were as follows. 1. I spoke up against sexual violence and faced our culture's wrath. That has to change. 2. Then 2 years ago, I became a public figure representing domestic abuse, and I felt the full force of our culture's wrath for women who speak out. And 3. I had the rare vantage point of seeing in real time how institutions protect men accused of abuse. Amber Heard then countersued in 2021, claiming that Johnny Depp's former attorney, Adam Waldman, made a false and defamatory statement on Depp's behalf to the Daily Mail in 2020. The statement reads, "Quite simply, this was an ambush, a hoax. They set Mr. Depp up by calling the cops, but the first attempt didn't do the trick. The officers came to the penthouses, thoroughly searched and interviewed, and left after seeing no damage to face or property. So Amber and her friends spilled a little wine and roughed the place up, got their story straight under the direction of a lawyer and a publicist, and then placed a second call to 911. So, what does this mean they had to prove? From my understanding, this meant that Johnny had to prove Amber Heard's statements were false, that he did not abuse her, and that the statements she made were about him, intending to cause damage to his reputation and thus his career. Amber had to prove that Mr. Waldman's statements were false, that she did not fake abuse at the hands of Johnny Depp, that the statements were of the opinion of Johnny Depp, essentially made on his behalf, and that these statements caused harm to her reputation and damage to her career. For this case specifically, when I'm referring to proving abuse, I mean physical abuse. It appears that Amber and Johnny were both verbally and emotionally abusive to one another, but because of the fact that Amber is only claiming physical abuse, those other types of abuse aren't being taken into consideration. After watching the trial for many weeks, there are 3 main points I would like to make as a result. The first being that men are victims of domestic violence too. It seems to me that Johnny Depp sued Amber Heard in order to get the story straight, rather than to collect any money. This was stated directly by Depp's attorneys, and I see no reason not to believe them. It also appears that collecting money was not the main goal of the lawsuit, because in Virginia, the state that the trial took place in, there is a statutory cap of $350,000, a great reduction to the $15 million Depp was awarded as a result of the trial. The Me Too movement played a large role in this case due to the timing of Amber Heard's opinion editorial, or op-ed, in the Washington Post. In 2018, the movement was at its peak as many women had begun speaking up against their abusers, and change was finally being made to prevent this from happening to other women. This was the year Amber Heard published the op-ed. Me Too has been taken to an extreme by some who state we should, quote, believe all women. An interesting argument to this statement was presented in an article written by an attorney I saw commenting on this case, Natalie Whittingham-Burrell. I will link this article in the description of the podcast if you'd like to read it in full. Whittingham-Burrell argues that in order for the statement, believe all women, to be productive, we must also agree to the inverse, disbelieve all men. This is an extremely dangerous statement to consider because of the fact that about 24% of domestic violence victims are male. Even my own instinct at the beginning of this case was to believe a woman, but survivors of domestic abuse are not always women. Amber Heard was found by a court of law to not be a victim of domestic violence, and I agree with this decision. The evidence presented in the trial did not reflect the degree of violence Amber described in her testimony. It appears that Heard likely fabricated horrific tales of abuse in order to have leverage in her divorce from Johnny Depp. Amber Heard should not be taken seriously as a victim of domestic abuse because she is not one. Her claims that she is being silenced due to Johnny Depp's fame are quite honestly ridiculous. When the op-ed was originally published in 2018, everyone believed Amber. And the only reason people don't believe her now is because they have seen evidence that she is lying. Amber displays no characteristics or signs of being a victim of abuse, and for her to falsely claim in such a public way that she is one is incredibly disrespectful to all survivors of domestic violence. Men are survivors too. The second point I would like to make about this case is that from watching the trial and analyzing the evidence presented, I, along with the jury, believe that Amber Heard is neither reliable nor credible. This was very evident to me through a few means. The first and most prevalent being that in order to believe her, every other witness, including her own witnesses and unbiased police personnel who were unaware that she was accusing Johnny Depp of abuse when called to their home, would have to be discredited. Her testimony was frequently inconsistent, leading me to believe she was lying. Another reason I believe Amber is not credible is because of the fact that she bought a large knife for Johnny Depp. If she was truly being physically abused and was afraid of Johnny abusing her, why would she buy her abuser a weapon? Amber Heard and many witnesses testified to Johnny Depp allowing Amber's friends to live in adjoining penthouse apartments he owned. A very common sign of domestic violence is isolation, and this displays the very opposite. Though her friends lived right next to Amber, they testified to never witnessing any abuse by Johnny, even though they were constantly around Amber. This just doesn't seem likely in a true domestic violence scenario as horrific as Amber alleged. The photos Amber provided as evidence of the described violent abuse also did not reflect the horrifying details she testified to. The most glaring reason I find Amber Heard to be unreliable is that though she legally claimed her Washington Post op-ed was not about Johnny Depp, she admitted it on the stand in court that she wrote it about him. The third and final point I would like to make about this case is that there is an evident cycle of abuse present in Johnny Depp's life that makes his testimony more believable. Johnny Depp and his sister Christy Dombrowski both testified during the trial that their mother was both abusive towards their father and towards her children. Their father was described as to have avoided confrontation with their mother, often hiding and hitting inanimate objects in order to deal with his frustrations. This behavior was modeled by Johnny, as he was seen in video evidence, heard in audio evidence, and had multiple testimonies recounting him directing his anger towards throwing objects at walls and hiding from Amber when wishing to avoid confrontation with her. It is common in homes with domestic violence for children to see coping mechanisms modeled by parents and to adopt them into their own life. Johnny clearly did this and demonstrated it in his relationship with Amber. It is also a common issue that children who grow up around domestic violence see this behavior as normal or believe that love is painful. Abuse is never normal or acceptable, but if the cycle is not broken, children never learn any different and often grow up to have it repeated in their own lives. This highly publicized case should be viewed for that reason, rather than as a means of having a window into the lives of celebrities. I hope you learned a little bit about the Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard defamation trial, especially if you did not watch it or know much about it. I would highly recommend watching the recap videos by a YouTube channel called Legal Bites if you are interested in hearing more in-depth details about the trial. I will leave a link to those videos in the podcast description. Of course, I also recommend doing your own research and watching the trial itself, but with 6 weeks of footage and evidence going back years, it was a bit lengthy. As always, it is my goal with the Love Doesn't Hurt podcast to create another resource people can use to understand their experiences, get help, and know they're not alone. If you need immediate help, please call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233 or text START in all capital letters to 88788. You can also visit their website, thehotline.org, for more information. If you enjoyed this episode or learned something new, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a new episode. If you would like to support the podcast, I would really appreciate you giving it a 5-star rating wherever you listen. Thank you for listening to the Love Doesn't Hurt podcast. I hope you all have a great day, and remember, spread love everywhere you go.